What's up, guys? Connor O'Hanlon here again, and today I will be joining you for another episode of the Con O Show. Today I am a solo act, which is unique now, I guess, because the last couple episodes I've been joined by guests. But today it's just me, and I will be discussing a very relevant topic to the times that we're in. And it's come up to me a few times because of the George Floyd protests, what the solutions are. It's come up in some of my interviews with Kaya and with Chandler. But today we're going to be discussing the war on drugs and how that disproportionately affects black communities, and it still does affect white communities, so don't get me wrong, we'll get into that. And I want to explain why it's important as someone who's white and not going to be disproportionately targeted for some of these things to stand up against it. And I'm going to make quite a few different arguments about it. It's not just going to be the morality of it, which, for most people, maybe not most, but for a ton of people, that should just be the easiest knockout. Like, okay, yeah, I don't think, whatever. I don't think that people should be going to jail for having some leaves. But then we can dive more into the racist origins of it, which I'll probably start more with the origin of the war on drugs right from the get-go. But then I also want to talk about the economic impact on all of America and how that will affect us for generations to come and how it already has affected us for generations. But yeah, so without further ado, we'll get right into it, but I'll say up front, if you guys are checking this out, please do like the show on Facebook, The Con O Show, because you'll get updates when I upload. And that way we can get in more engagement there and we'll get some more following. I would really appreciate that. And if you enjoy the show, that would really help me out. You can follow me personally on Twitter at Con O'Hanlon, just for all my personal tweets. And I am riled up right now because I just saw a tweet about Ben Shapiro on there that I had to respond to. So that's also why I'm like, okay, war on drugs, let's go. So, how did we get to the war on drugs, and how do we understand it in modern day society versus, in the 70s when it started or in the 80s when it was expanded? Today, it's pretty well known, I would say, that the war on drugs is bad. I think a lot of people understand that, and a lot of people really want to fight against what this system has perpetuated. People ask what racist systems or what racist policies exist today in the United States, and this is one of the most apparent and glaring ones. So, if you don't know what the war on drugs is, let's take us back, rewind to the 1960s. Say we're in like the summer of love or something like that. And in the 60s, there was a lot of drug use and a lot of recreational drug use. And then to the 70s as well, we had, all the hippies and all this, whatnot. And it's kind of stereotypical. I don't know if the actual drug usage rate is comparable to what it is today. I would probably venture to guess that it is, or that it was. But it's like almost a meme that, the 60s and 70s was about, love and drugs and whatever. So the reactionaries, which at the time, in the late 60s, would be Richard Nixon into the early 70s. Whereas we had FDR and then LBJ for some of these more, and I'm being very generous because obviously LBJ had the Vietnam War, right, and FDR had problems with Japanese internment, but these were like the progressives of the time, which pushed us way, way, way forward, and we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I believe, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We were making giant strides. We weren't there yet. We still aren't there yet. But we were getting closer. Social progress was happening. Economic progress was happening. Then we get President Richard Nixon, and he is looking. So, side note here, if you look back, it's very hard to find a Republican president since Dwight Eisenhower, who's been rightfully elected. And I can suggest you read, I believe it's The Hidden History of the Supreme Court by Tom Hartman, if you want a more deep dive into that. But for example, we have Watergate with Nixon. We have the Iran-Contra scandal. A lot of Iran stuff with Reagan, et cetera, et cetera. It's a fascinating history, and I would suggest you go read up on that if you want, if it's something of interest to you. That's not today's topic, but I just want to inject that real quick. So back to Nixon. He, of course, was looking for an edge to win his next election. That being said, this is before he's impeached, etc. But in 1971, they declare a war on drugs. The idea is that drug use was, quote, public enemy number one. Not violent crime, not rape or murder or any of these, or racism or sexism, because those things, as much as they exist today, were a lot worse 50 years ago, 40 years ago. But yeah, no, of course, it's drug use is public enemy number one. We then have to look at the motives of Nixon, and then the actual, the front is we're going to stop crime because drugs are bad. But Nixon's real, true motive behind it was to arrest black youth, white youth, and just leftists in general. Because those were his number one hurdle to get over to winning re-election. Which I know if you've never heard this, it might sound crazy or made up. It's pretty well documented today, and I think it's his chief of staff. He has policy advisors that in the 90s and in the early 2000s, and even some a couple years ago, were openly admitting, yeah, that was the goal. That was the goal, and that was it. Basically, he was trying to put black people and hippies in jail so he could win a re-election. I know it might sound crazy, but you can fact check me on that. You could go look it up, and you could read. There's plenty of books on it. There's plenty of statements on it, and it's pretty much proven. So what happens is that it starts off kind of small, and it just grows and grows and grows. I didn't know this, but in researching this, during the 70s, at least 11 states decriminalized marijuana under Jimmy Carter. So, again, it's like, for the step forward we're getting like a giant step back, but at least there was some progress under Jimmy Carter to think of, and Jimmy Carter definitely, I feel like it's a bad rap. But nevertheless, we get into the 80s after Jimmy Carter, and we get to Ronald Reagan, which I think Ronald Reagan is probably more notoriously associated with the war on drugs, because Nancy Reagan's just say no campaign. Ronald Reagan expanded it pretty big, and then there was a lot of there's a few laws that were passed under Ronald Reagan that made it a lot worse. So just like, for example, we have the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum sentencing. So we're going to go into our first, basically, divergence of, at least, in this episode. Obviously, I think during the 60s, during the 70s, there was definitely disproportionate targeting of black communities. But this is a prime example of it, because mandatory minimums are disproportionately applied to people who have been arrested that are black and that are being charged with a similar crime as someone that is white. But the mandatory minimums are slapped on there, again proving the racist roots of this. So the greatest example of this is, if you know something about drug use in the 80s, cocaine was a big drug. If you had crack instead of powdered cocaine, you would go to jail for an extremely longer amount of time than if you had regular powder cocaine. Well, why is this? I can't tell you their justification, but disproportionately, African Americans were using crack, white Americans were using cocaine. But now, if you had 5 grams you would need of crack, you would need to have the equivalent of 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same mandatory minimum of 5-year sentence. So how does that happen? Like, how can you possibly explain the fact that it's unless I'm vastly mistaken, it's chemically the same exact drug. The delivery methods are different. But it is really, really apparent that this is an issue based on race for it. It's crazy. So that kind of lays the groundwork for now, at least for the origins of the war on drugs. Now, there's ebbs and flows. There are times where it gets worse, times where it gets better. But a lot of what I'm going to move on to now is about statistics and facts around prisons, around sentencing, around the disproportionality of it towards black people. And you guys can totally fact check me on these things if you disagree. A lot of this stuff is just I knew from reading a bunch of books that I've read. I'll plug A Colony in a Nation is a good book right now if you want to go pick a simple, easy read that will describe the war on drugs and also describe the disproportionality of between the two communities with drug use. But let's also not forget, before I dive into this, that we have the opioid epidemic as well. So this is why it's important that I want to point out that, if you're feeling challenged almost by like what I'm saying or by what I'm putting out here, by saying like, oh, no, white people, whatever, it's bad for them too. Well, the opioid epidemic does this disproportionately affect white Americans. Now, there's a lot more service paid to the opioid epidemic, but at the same time, we really should be working to decriminalize these drugs so these people can go and get help rather than going to prison for having heroin, because the pharmaceutical companies that got them hooked on the opioids in the beginning really should be held liable for at least, for whatever can be proven. But if you're so desperate to get that drug, and really addiction is a disease, so if you were that desperate that you have to go to heroin, as long as you're not beating the crap out of someone to get it, I don't think you're a criminal. I think that you're an addict and you need help. So but we have to apply the same standard when it comes to other drugs, when it comes to drugs that are not in the white community, or maybe they are in the white community, but it's decriminalized here, or it's you're just way more likely to not get caught having marijuana in the suburbs as you are in an urban setting because the over policing. We have to realize and know these places of privilege. It's not that much to ask. But I just want to insert that because I'm not going to talk about the opioid epidemic today beyond what I just mentioned. But it is a huge, huge part of the war on drugs. If we want to address criminality around drugs, that is a major part of it. Heroin and opioids. So I have a lot of facts. So I'll probably end up reading one of them all off, and then I'll probably get deeper into it. I might go one or two into it and then take a little pause and go into it. First of all, we're going to be talking about a lot of prison stats. So every 25 seconds in America, someone is arrested for drug possession. I will repeat that. Every 25 seconds. Not minutes, not hours, seconds. The number of Americans that have been arrested for possession of drugs has tripled since 1980. That number is 1.3 million arrests per year. And that is 6 times the number of arrests for selling drugs. I'll get into the economic argument in a couple minutes, but how many people's lives have to be ruined because they just wanted to take a load off? Marijuana is safer than alcohol. I'll take anyone to the mat on that. And although I don't like marijuana particularly, it should be 100% recreationally legal. That would save so many people's lives. And I'll talk about the money from tax revenue later, but depending on what we decide to do with that money, one option is paying for addiction services, which is what, the gambling has that, alcoholics have that. But if you, for some reason, are addicted, and yes, you can get addicted to marijuana, not in the same way. It's not addicting like nicotine is addicting, but mentally you can be addicted to anything. So if you get addicted to marijuana, or you get addicted to an opioid, or you get addicted to whatever drug that I might not even know of, then you get help. You don't get prison. You get help. You need help, you get help. I said that in my healthcare, an episode about healthcare. You need help, you should get help. That's the way it should go. We can provide it. There is no limiting factor here. We can provide it. Next, we'll go 1/5 of the incarcerated population in the United States is serving for a drug charge. 1/5, so 20%. There's another 1.15 million people on probation and parole for drug-related offenses. So the 1/5 of all incarcerated people is 456,000 people. We have, it's funny because I want, and I'm not saying this to put down America, but I want to be great, and I don't think having the largest prison population in the world makes us great. But we do. It's not because we have the most criminals, not because, whatever. I mean, you can hear a ton of dumb, I'll be frank, dumb arguments about this. It's because we over-police certain aspects of our culture and our world, and we criminalize poverty. We don't address poverty. You can apply a lot of what I'm saying as I go down these statistics. I want to get rid of the war on drugs, but I also want to fight poverty. They go hand in hand because a lot of people will fall into drug and alcohol abuse. There's nothing wrong with recreational use, but abuse is bad. And the reason why, there's tons and tons of reasons why. But it's the same reason with divorce, right? Money causes problems. When it comes to drug use, if you're in poverty and your life just, I don't even want to go into, if you're homeless and you could get high, I don't even blame the person. You get to escape from the reality of what you have. Why would we blame that person? We don't know. I don't know what choices that person has made that get them that point in their life. But why not offer them a hand up? Rather than throw them in jail. We're putting people in cages for having drugs. Come on. It's so crazy. Beyond that, before I go into some other effects, it's also important to point out that incarcerating people has, at least for drug offenses, has shown little to no impact on substance misuse and abuse. But it's also linked to an increased mortality rate upon release from jail. Because I don't know. I can only posit why, but the stats say that you're 13 times more likely to die in your first 2 weeks after being released from prison than the average population. And the leading cause is overdose. So it's not like, they're going to get into a gang and they get into a shooting. No. People get out and they're addicts. The first thing that their minds are going to go to is, boom, I need to get whatever. I need to get drunk. I need to find some heroin, whatever it is. So rather than helping them get treatment, we made them go spend time in jail. So any sort of training, any sort of professionals that could have actually helped, nope, sorry. That money is spent on putting you in cages. And that's not to even fully dive into the problem of private prisons that profit off of people being in jail for non-violent drug offenses. Yeah, so and also it shows you. If you're listening to this, you may have heard of broken glass broken windows policing from the '90s, and that's a lot of people attribute a fallen crime from that. But there are many, many other real solutions that have came up that have lowered criminality and lowered crime. But also, there's no evidence that incarceration has lowered the crime rate. A really quick tangent on this. I do find this to be a very interesting reason and explanation. Is that in, I believe, the 70s, they got rid of lead paint. So if you don't know, lead, if it gets in your bloodstream, and this is why it's important, like when we talk about Flint, Michigan, or you talk about having lead in your water, because that happens here even in Pennsylvania. When you talk about that stuff, lead in the water, or in your bloodstream, is one, obviously it's dangerous for your entire life. It's life-threatening if you have way too much lead. But lead in your bloodstream increases aggression, and it increases the disabilities of learning. So if we take these ideas and we extrapolate them and say, okay, a generation after we get rid of lead in wall paint, we get rid of lead in pencils, and we get rid of lead in, like, et cetera, et cetera. And lead in gas is a huge one. A generation later, the crime rate starts to drop. And that's the age. So my numbers may be slightly off, but if you take the 70s when they outlawed it, the 90s, when especially young males are in their peak of being a threat for criminal behavior in their 20s, the rate starts to decline. I think that's just an interesting tangent here to go off and explore, and you can read more into it. I'm not 100% sure if that's the case, but it's at least a compelling argument. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know every in and out of like the lead in people's blood, but I have heard and I've read up on it a little bit, and that's, if you have higher lead density in your blood, you're going to be more likely to be aggressive. Being aggressive will more likely get you in trouble for crime, and violent crime in particular. But violent crime has been declining since the 90s. So it's a good example of how that might be an answer. So then we're going to go into comparisons now a little bit. If you're black in America, you're 4 times more likely to get arrested for marijuana than your white counterparts, despite only being 12.5% of substance users. That means there's a huge portion of the population that are not black that make up the vast majority of marijuana users. And yet you're 4 times more likely to get arrested for it. For use, for possession, not for selling. Because I know that's some people's defense are going to be, well, selling. No, possession. 80%, or almost 80%, of people serving time in jail, or I should say in prison, for federal drug offenses are either black or Latino. 80%. Despite the fact that white people use drugs, specifically if we just want to use marijuana, at the exact same rate as Black and Latino community. I don't actually know, the Latino community is probably less than the white and black communities. I know the fact is that white and black people use marijuana at the same rate. And you're 4 times more likely to get arrested for it if you're black. That makes total sense, right? When we get back to sentencing disparities, if you're a black drug offender and you get sentenced, your sentence is more likely to be compatible with that of a white violent crime offender. So if you are arrested for drugs, you're more likely to have the same sentence as someone that may have assaulted somebody. That's so crazy. And I'll say right now, a lot of this stuff is, if it's your first time ever hearing some of this stuff, you might be shocked. But a lot of the time, I hear these statistics or I hear this stuff and I'm not even shocked because of the systems that we have in place. The history that we have in place. If this is, I swear, if you have listened for a few weeks now and you have not looked up the story of Emmett Till or all these people that I was telling you about in 2 or 3 weeks ago in my episodes to look up in the stories, my God, please do. History is so important for the context of how we are here and how these policies are created. I don't have every answer. I don't have every knowledge of history. And anyone that tells you that they do is lying to you. But it's important to know as much as you can so that you can change the future. We don't want to be doomed to repeat every little thing as global fascism rises. I mean, geez. We're seeing some of the same stuff as the lead up into World War II. I mean, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. But, you know, there's no two sides to racism. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. They're not equal. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you're complacent, then you're actively working for the oppressor. If we move on now, as I'm already getting fired up, because this is, wealth inequality and economic justice is my wheelhouse. That's what I prefer to fight on. So I'm already going to be worked up now, but the money and the economic impacts that we have on people are so crushing because of the war on drugs. For example, since 1971, we've spent an estimated $1 trillion with a T dollars. Now, if you had Medicare for all, it would cost a lot of money too. Well, no. We're talking about literally just putting people in jail and arresting them for having drugs. $1 trillion. Think about how much money that really is. The federal government, this is statistics from 2015, spent $9.2 million a day to incarcerate people that have been charged with drug-related offenses. That equates to $3.3 billion per year, on top of state governments that spend $7 billion per year. So $10 billion spent just on drug offense. That is so ridiculous. Last statistic that I have on here is that if we legalized marijuana, we would save an estimated $7.7 billion per year. And we would generate $6 billion in tax revenue each year. That revenue could be used for addiction services. In theory, the savings plus the $6,000 in general revenue additions, it has been estimated that it could help pay for pre-K or even some public universities, etc. I mean, we can go down the line and figure out what we would want to spend it on, but the fact is, there are places that you can spend this money on that are better than putting people in cages. No matter what. I will close this episode by saying one final piece on the economic impact. I see a lot of people using the cultural argument against reparations or ending the war on drugs or doing this or that, raising the minimum wage. There's a lot of really disingenuous arguments, but if you take the cultural argument of saying, well, and I'm not saying this to be clear because I do not, but like if you took someone like Ben Shapiro or these people like that, because I know that's what got me onto this topic for today anyway, where are the black fathers? Well, the system that has been created has put them in jail or in prison. Generation after generation. They've been oppressed. So when you take the father or whoever out, or you take the child and put him in jail, now what are his employment options going to be when he gets out of jail? They're going to be slim. So it's an endless cycle of, well, you're arresting people and putting them in jail and you're ending their lives and their careers early. And yeah, you could make the choice, you could make the argument that it's a choice to use drugs. Sure, but it's not a valid argument because it's not something you should go to jail for. An unjust law does not equate to you should be in jail for the rest of your life, or you should basically never be able to get a good job, which is basically what happens. You could barely even get your right to vote. Only in certain places. If you go to prison after you serve your time, after you're on parole, etc., 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 you can't even vote in a lot of places. It's few and far between that you can. So if you make one bad mistake, or even if you make 2 or 3, it's clear that our system is focused on punishing people, and it's all punitive rather than reforming. If we took the time to reform people, even if it's 50% of them are reformed and they feel better and they have a new grasp on things, rather than just punishing people, it would be worth it. If we just invested in these people and in the communities, rather than just being like, oh, no, we can't invest in criminals. No, we can. We have to. This goes beyond race. This is white, black, Asian, Hispanic, anything, male, female. If you make a mistake, you can be saved. You can be reformed. You're not inherently bad because you made one decision that was poor. I get so worked up with the cultural argument of, because again, I could spend probably an hour on just about this, but what would lead someone to, if I was a black father Or even if I wasn't, even if I was just me, and I had kids, I don't, but if I had kids, and I was in poverty, and I couldn't get any sort of assistance, and my kids were hungry, God, you know that people will do anything for their kids and their family. So it's such a BS argument. So we have to free the people that are in jail unjustly. We have to end the war on drugs. We have to ban private prisons. We have to go down the line. We have to get rid of all this stuff. But today, my focus has been ending the war on drugs. So I hope that you learned something, or at least you got something out of this episode. If you did, please do like the Kano Show on Facebook. You can follow me at Kano Hanlon on Twitter. And always, if you can, please share this video, or sorry, not this video. Please share this podcast with whoever you feel may enjoy it. If you need suggestions on books or anything like that, please reach out. And if you have suggestions on topics or guests in the future, please do not hesitate to let me know. I appreciate you guys making it all the way here with me, and I will see you next week.